The issue of North Korea is one that has perplexed us all for quite a long time. It's one that continues to take and raise questions of how should we approach North Korea. Are our increased economic sanctions the best way to go? Should we take and re-engage in more robust efforts in diplomacy? Should we consider other alternatives such as economic engagement? These are all very difficult questions which have many different issues attached to them in terms of, is the situation right? Is the regime in North Korea prepared to take and engage in the types of activities that we might need in terms of getting a positive response from them? So we're hoping to look at some of these questions and hopefully come away with perhaps a better understanding of maybe where we need to go as opposed to perhaps a definitive answer, because I think if there were a definitive answer, we might already be there. I'll just very briefly introduce them both. You have the bios with you, but as you all know, Ambassador Bosworth is currently a senior fellow at the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs at Harvard's Kennedy School of Government. He had an extensive career in the Department of State, and he served as the ambassador to the Republic of Korea from 1997 to 2001. He also served as the U.S. Special Representative for North Korea policy under the Obama administration from 2009 to 2011. And he was the founding executive director of the Korean Peninsula Energy Development Organization from 1995 to 1997. Dr. Marcus Noland is the executive vice president and director of studies at the Peterson Institute for International Economics. His research addresses a wide range of topics at the intersection of economics, political science, international relations, and uniquely among economists, he is focused on topics that deal with North Korea's economy and the prospects for Korean unification. He also won the 2000-2001 O'Hara Memorial Award for his book, Avoiding the Apocalypse, The Future of the Two Koreas. And with that, I think I'd like to take and perhaps start briefly with the current situation on the peninsula, Ambassador Bosworth. The 3-year mourning period for Kim Jong-il recently ended this past December, and by all indications, Kim Jong-un has continued to consolidate his power. How would you assess how the regime has changed under Kim Jong-un and what the changes in North Korea mean for its nuclear program?
Well, first, Troy, let me thank you, the Institute, for hosting this affair today. And also say how much pleasure it gives me to see some familiar faces out there. I avoid the term old familiar faces because my face is older than most of them. But anyway, it's nice to be back here, and it's nice to be in Washington, even though it's not so nice to talk about North Korea. As you indicated with your introduction of me, I've spent more years than I like to admit dealing with North Korea, going way back to the 90s when I was running Cato. And that, I think, has given me a certain perspective on the challenges of dealing with North Korea. It's also given me a degree of humility, which some of my friends and my wife would say is uncharacteristic of my general approach. But I really have great admiration for people who try to deal with this problem in the government. I tried that on a couple of occasions. And I would say, before commenting on your question, that I think this is one of the most intractable, complicated, difficult issues that I have ever had any experience with in my more than now 50 years of working in the area of international affairs and U.S. policy. This is truly challenging, not among other reasons, because it is so interrelated to our position in this very critical region of the world, and so tied into our relationship with South Korea, our relationship with Japan, to say nothing now of our relationship with China. Over the last several years, I've been dealing with not just talking to North Koreans, but also, when I was special representative, talking intensively on a very regular basis to the Chinese, to the South Koreans, to the Japanese. And never once did I feel I had somehow stumbled on true wisdom. And I think everyone is struggling to try to figure out what to do with this one. But in response to your questions, first, I, with the advantage of some perspective, now conclude that one of the more significant factors which has had influence on our policy and our inability to seemingly come up with a policy that does everything we would like it to do, has been the fact that North Korea has been going through a transition of leadership. And as we know well, they are very inwardly focused. And the stakes in this transition, going back, I think, probably to even 2008, 2009, have been enormously complicated and literally life and death matters for a large portion of the North Korean elite. And as I look back at the efforts we made in the early years of the Obama administration to work out a policy of engagement, I think the existence of the transition, even though Kim Jong-il was still around, the existence of that transition process, which we, quite frankly, only vaguely understood, was a major reason why we were not able to engage. It may be that we couldn't have engaged effectively anyway, but I think we underestimated, to the extent we understood it, the degree to which they were traumatized, if you will, or fixated on the transition of leadership at the very top. And over the last 3 years, I think that that has been a determining factor. Now, is it over? I don't know, because I don't know what they think. I don't know if they think that the transition is a point between two transitions, or if indeed there is some goal they're trying to get to, at which time they will be more confident in their dealings with the outside world. I know from my own conversations in various fora with Chinese, they're puzzled by these same questions. And I don't think that that there's suddenly going to be a new dawn and we're going to be dealing with a North Korea that is more self-confident, more able to deal with the outside world. I think this will happen very gradually. As for the effect of all of this on their attachment to their nuclear program, I don't think that the transition, assuming it's completed at some point, is really going to affect that all that much. I think what could affect that is a change in the external environment and a change in what they see as the balance of costs and benefits from beginning to have a different view on their nuclear weapons program.
Thank you. So, Dr. Noland, speaking of costs and benefits, North Korea has tried under the Beyond-Jin line to pursue both its nuclear weapons program and economic development. And in contrast, the United States has tried to sort of show it the costs and benefits of that attempt. How successful have they been in sort of shifting towards more economic development since Kim Jong-un has come to power?
Well, like Steve, I would like to start off by thanking you for having me here. Here in Washington, I get lots of invitations to talk, and you don't know a priori if that is time well spent or not. But in this case, since you had already gotten Steve, I knew we were going to get a very high quality audience, so I figured, yes, my time is going to be well spent this afternoon. So thank you for inviting me. So, the Beyond-Jin line, I think, it's not a policy, it's a slogan. It, in my mind, elevates a contradiction to the level of doctrine. I just don't see how you can, on the one hand, say I'm open for business, and on the other hand, be waving nuclear weapons at the world's largest economy. My sense, and Vice President Mondale once said, anybody who tells you they're an expert on North Korea is a liar or a fool. My corollary to this is don't trust any number on North Korea that comes with a decimal point attached. So we have a vague sense that in the last several years, the economy has done better than it had done in the previous several years. And that seems to be driven by a few different forces. There seems to have been some relaxation of control in terms of local markets. And basic economic theory is if you repress something very tightly, when you start to ease up, you'll initially get big gains because there's been such repression. Secondly, North Korea benefited from the run-up in world commodity prices. It is increasingly a kind of extractive industry-driven economy, selling most of this to China, and the prices seem to track world prices. So when the world price for various metals and ores went up, North Korea did better. And thirdly, the very northern part of the country and the area such as the city of Chongqing seems to have benefited from increased integration with China. So The next issue then is, to what extent can one generalize from anecdotal evidence coming out of Pyongyang? One of the problems in North Korea is most visitors simply visit the city of Pyongyang and they draw their inferences from that. And in that kind of system, you can channel resources into that city without the rest, at the expense of the rest of the economy. So my overall sense is that the economy is improving somewhat for those three reasons, that improvement is very unequally shared. It is basically the fruits of those developments are being channeled into the city of Pyongyang. You've got some kind of regional specific benefits associated with trade with China. And other parts of the country, both provincial cities and rural areas, are stagnating if not falling behind. So it's a very uneven picture. Policy itself has been erratic. And what we haven't seen in North Korea is any kind of decisive break with the past, any kind of decisive, we're going to go in a new direction, or a new team of people has been authorized or empowered to take the economy in a new direction. So I would say right now you have some modest gains, they are reversible, they are being shared unequally, and it is an economy increasingly dependent on the exportation of raw materials, mainly to China.
To sort of follow up on that a little, as resources get funneled into the capital, at least amongst the elites, there is a rising level of income, and more people have a stake in the prospects of the economy. How does that perhaps change the dynamic going forward, and does that put pressure on the regime itself then to perhaps open up more, or at least preclude further closing from the outside?
That's a really good question. I hope at some point in our time we'll talk about sanctions and engagement, because I think if we are going to engage with North Korea, our fundamental goal ought to be transforming the regime. And to do that, you want to empower, if not non-state actors, then at least state actors that are under less tight control of central authorities than others. And that's not easy to do. So I hope we can get back to that. But your question, in terms of development, kind of a middle class in Pyongyang, it is both. It could be both positive and negative. As I said, one of the drivers of what appears to be somewhat greater prosperity or growth in the last several years has been the rise in commodity prices. It's not been due to real fundamental economic policy changes, and this is a government that has no real macroeconomic policy tools. So what goes up can go down. And as world commodity prices have started going down, you've actually seen the value of North Korean exports to China going down, because the prices are going down. Now, North Korea also seems to have benefited from the fall in oil prices. So the net effect at this point is a little unclear. But I would say that a point of vulnerability for the regime is, after a period of growth, of things getting better and rising expectations, if you had a precipitous fall in world commodity prices, especially if that was driven by a major contraction in China, then I think this regime could be in real trouble, because everything would go into reverse, and they don't have QE. They don't have the tools of macroeconomic policy management to try to offset that. But at the same time, I think that it is a process that may constrain their ability to go backwards in some ways, but I would not overstate that. Just this morning, I was reading some material about how the security authorities, according to this one report, have been authorized to actually not only crack down on unauthorized border trade, but actually do extrajudicial killings to crack down on border trade. Now, extrajudicial killings may be a little bit fine a distinction in North Korea, but the instruction that I was shown was that what they could do is, if they thought something bad was happening, they could go ahead and shoot the fellow, and then they needed to report it back ex post. I mean, they had to file the paperwork still, but you did it ex post. And so, it's, as I said, it is a government that is never really been comfortable with the market. When things get better, they have a tendency to crack down. So you see problems with NGOs right now and expulsion of NGOs. I don't think this is a government that has firmly embraced reform in any sort of real way.
I do want to take and focus mostly on sort of the different options we have and the benefits or potential costs of those options. So, Ambassador Bosworth, if we, and I would think many of us would agree that the military option is off the table in terms of dealing with North Korea, one of the most direct ways would seemingly be diplomacy. You served in the Obama administration. It's held talks with Cuba about opening up relations. We're negotiating a nuclear deal with Iran. It's played a role in bringing Myanmar back into the international community. Diplomacy is clearly something that the Obama administration has done a great deal of. Can diplomacy be successful with North Korea? And if so, is the six-party talks the best format, or should we be looking for another venue?
I think, as you point out, in the end, when you work your way through all of these options, you're left with diplomacy because all the other options are singularly unattractive. Now, we have had difficulty because of our own political tensions and because of our need to maintain a balance with all the other countries out in the region, and because of the difficulty of dealing at all with North Korea. We have had great difficulty in sustaining diplomacy toward North Korea. Go way back to the, well, not that far back, but 20 years at least. And we've been very challenging for us to sustain a policy line toward North Korea. They have a much different sense of time than we do. And I think that they have been ready for the last couple of years to re-engage diplomatically. Now, that doesn't mean that they're prepared to make great concessions. But I do think that, as I say, working your way through all of the other options, including the option, if I might say so, of what we, for reasons I don't quite understand, call strategic patience. Why are we patient about this? It's true that North Korea is not doing bad things right now, except, and if it weren't for the fact that we assume that they're continuing to develop nuclear weapons, I would say fine, engagement with them is too difficult. So let's let this play out for a while. But I think some of the estimates about where they could be in their nuclear program 5 years from now are undoubtedly exaggerated, but there's no question in my mind that they could be significantly ahead of where they are now. And I don't think that's a good thing from our point of view.
If they were to be willing to actually engage on the nuclear issue, which they may not be at this point for various reasons, is there anything we can learn from the Iran deal in terms of the framework that's been at least announced so far? Or are the talks with Iran in essence really more politically significant in showing that we can do this process with a country that we have a dispute with, and showing the North Koreans that this really is possible?
Well, I have no doubt that the North Koreans are watching very carefully what we're doing or not doing with the Iranians. There are great differences. One difference, primary difference, is the neighborhood. The neighborhood in which Iran is present is very different from the one in which North Korea is present. But I think that there are things we can learn from North Korea or from the Iranian experience. On the other hand, you could argue that we haven't really gone to the end of the road with Iran yet. I mean, that's still a framework agreement. It's got a lot of uncertainty in it. It's going to be very dependent in the end on inspection and enforcement. And we're a long way from having to worry about those issues with North Korea because we're not really even talking to them at this point.
So, you wanted to talk about sanctions. In the case of Iran, one of the issues, or one of the beliefs, is that the additional sanctions we placed on them, specifically the oil, brought them back to the negotiating table. There has been a push in the U.S. House. Last year they passed a new sanctions bill. It's been reintroduced. I believe it's passed the committee, but not the full House yet. But with a Republican Senate, the odds of it passing both houses is probably greater now. How effective can either the specific House sanctions bill or just additional sanctions in general be in dealing with North Korea?
Well, sanctions have a role to play, but I don't think we should exaggerate what they're likely to accomplish. If you look at the history of sanctions, sanctions work basically when the target is small and weak and the whole world is on the other side, and what you're sanctioning them over is not a core political goal of the sanctioned regime. And in that case, sanctions can be pretty effective. In this case, the sanctions are aimed at a core political goal of the targeted regime, and we don't have a united front either. So I think sanctions may be supplementary or complementary or may help diplomacy in some way, but I think it goes against history and logic to think that in this particular case, economic sanctions will play a decisive role. Now, that doesn't mean I'm against sanctions. There are basically two types of sanctions. There's the sanctions that have been authorized by the UN Security Council, and then there's a much bigger web of sanctions, and I'll use that term loosely, various sorts of impediments to cross-border commercial exchange that have existed, that the United States has imposed unilaterally for decades. If you look at the UN sanctions, the bulk of those sanctions are what I would describe as defensive in nature. They are aimed at impeding, disrupting, whatever verb you want to use, North Korean military programs. And I think they're completely justified. I mean, we are essentially defending ourselves and our allies and the rest of the world against the behavior of this roguish regime. There's a smaller set of those UN sanctions that are essentially punitive in nature. Those are the ones that are aimed at luxury goods, and they're ineffective. If you write down a list of luxury goods on the sanctions list of the EU or Australia or Japan or some country you pick, and then you examine trade data, you will see that that trade or imports into North Korea of those products have risen monotonically since the imposition of sanctions. So they just don't work. The House bill is different in that it puts a much greater emphasis on financial sanctions. And financial sanctions and sanctions on traded goods really have different sort of economic logic and very different bureaucratic implications. Anywhere in the world, if a government attempts to sanction somebody in the sanctioning country is going to lose money. They've been selling stuff there, and now they can't sell anymore. And they're going to both try to circumvent those sanctions, and they're going to lobby to get them weakened. The financial sanctions, and North Korea is no different in that regard, the financial sanctions work on a very different logic. We have the largest market in the world, and we basically tell financial institutions, you have a choice. You can do business in North Korea, or you can do business here. And most of them make the commercially prudent decision. So financial sanctions are more effective in the sense that if you look at North Korea's single biggest trade partner, China, the way the sanctions in the UN Security Council work is the Chinese Foreign Ministry basically acts as North Korea's lawyer in the Security Council, and then when the sanctions get passed, it has to go to the Customs Administration to get them enforced. On financial sanctions, People's Bank looks at this situation, and they don't have any great stake in North Korea, and the big Chinese commercial banks have pulled out. Now, the North Koreans are not stupid. They have developed other sorts of channels, but they're smaller and they're weaker. So, sanctions have a role to play, but I don't think we should exaggerate their impact. And maybe to anticipate your next question, I feel the same way about engagement. Engagement may have a role to play, but it's unlikely to be decisive on these issues. Bottom line is North Korea, to a great extent, marches to its own drummer. And I think we in the outside world, it's a very important issue. We should devote as much time and resources to resolving it as we can, but we should not exaggerate our influence. At the end of the day, how this thing goes is largely going to be a function of the capacity and preferences of the North Korean regime.
I did want to ask about engagement, but since you brought it up as well, let's maybe, one of the more specific questions I would have about engagement would be, is not necessarily, we'll say, the writ large type of engagement that's been tried in the past, but more specifically, are there things we can do to where, when North Korea announces perhaps certain types of reforms, that would reinforce those reforms, in other words, to try and send them down a path we'd like to go? So not necessarily large-scale engagement, but specific targeted types.
So when I think about engagement in North Korea, I think that the goal is to try to transform the regime. And you engage with them to both create a greater stake in maintaining external economic ties, to empower groups within the regime that have a stake in those. So if through a variety of channels you want to change, if not the nature of the regime, at least its behavior, so it becomes less bellicose internationally and hopefully less repressive internally. To do that, you want to not only expand the amount of exchange, but you want to change the nature of the exchange. And that's very difficult. The North Koreans aren't stupid. So if you think about it from their standpoint, the best form of engagement is overflight rights. The airplane flies over North Korea at 38,000 feet, nobody even knows it's up there, and the money in hard currency goes straight to the North Korean treasury. Next best is railroads and pipelines, because those things just go through the country, government charges a tariff, it goes straight to the central authorities, and nobody knows the difference. Third best, enclaves, Mount Kumgang, Kaesong Industrial Complex. Yes, you have some interaction with foreigners, specifically South Koreans, but you can literally fence this stuff off. Fourth best is businessmen from foreign countries going around trying to make deals. And even worse is businessmen from foreign countries going around trying to make deals with entities that are not tightly controlled by the central government. They may have some kind of state status, they may not. That's who we want to push. We want to develop this kind of nascent private sector that isn't so under the thumb of the central government. That's a hard thing to do. I mean, when you get off of the 30,000 foot kind of Washington talking about things in rooms, and you think practically, how can I orient, say, an Ex-Im Bank program so that it's strengthening these nascent, rising, non-state controlled entities who don't have credit histories? They don't even have books that we would recognize in normal accounting. How you actually go about doing that practically is not an easy thing. So when I say engage, I want to engage with my eyes open. I want to push certain types of engagement that'll start changing the internal balance within North Korea. And I recognize the North Koreans understand exactly the Trojan horse aspect of that, and they're going to push in the other direction for types of engagement that are very tightly controlled. Money comes to the central government, and they can spend it any way they wish.
So, Ambassador Bosworth, from a diplomatic perspective, what do you see as, we've heard from Dr. Noland that sanctions may not be the most effective tool, but from your perspective, is there a role then for sanctions to try and bring the North Koreans back to the table? Or are there types of engagement, be they certain targeted economic types or even maybe, people to people and cultural type things we should be doing to try and move them in the direction we want to go?
I think the primary advantage of sanctions in almost all cases is that they give us the impression that we're actually doing something, that we're responding to a situation. I saw this in South Africa. I saw it in Cuba. I would set Iran and the recent actions there somewhat in a different track, because I think because of the existence of a politically influential economic middle class, I don't want to exaggerate that, but Iran was politically more susceptible to the pressures of sanctions, particularly since they're an oil exporter, and we said to the rest of the world, we're not going to buy any more of their oil. And that began to have a really substantial effect. In North Korea's case, I question the effectiveness of sanctions, and I think Marcus has given us all a good primer in why there are sanctions and then there are sanctions. I mean, this is a very weak, small, feeble economy. So to just tell them they can't do business with the rest of the world anymore doesn't really affect them all that much. But I think that it is important, and what is the goal? What are we trying to do? And regime transformation, rather than regime change, is as good a way to describe my view as any. The problem is, as Marcus has pointed out, and Marcus and I have had this conversation a few times over the years, they're not stupid, and they know what we're trying to do, and they will resist that. It's the same problem that Kim Dae-jung had in his Sunshine Policy. If he could have had a quiet, confidential conversation with the South Korean people, he might have been able to carry that a lot further than he was. But he knew that everything he said was being parsed and listened to by the North Koreans, and it's the same with us now. Also, I think it's important that we differentiate among the various forms and vehicles of engagement. It's come to mean, for many people, a sort of reincarnation of the massive diplomatic effort that was present in the six-party talks, when big chunks of all foreign ministries devoted enormous attention and resources and energy to these talks with the North Koreans. And I am not at all confident that a reiteration or a resumption of that effort is going to have any great benefit. I like the notion, and have for some time, of trying to segregate out areas in which we know they have an interest and giving them something in that area in return for something we can get. And I think we have to concentrate as much on what we would get from these various kinds of engagement as we do on what we would give. It requires, as I hinted earlier, a very different approach to the timeline of engagement with North Korea. We are a country with a very short attention span. So if a policy doesn't pay off certainly within one administration, the next administration junks it and goes on to something else. And in the case of North Korea, if you're going to see a transformation, it's going to take place over time, and it's going to require the undivided attention of more than one administration in this country. This is a problem that is 60 years in the making, and it's not going to go away in a matter of months, unless it goes away in a very different way, which is it just kind of suddenly implodes. And there, I think that we have to be conscious of this as we talk about sanctions and how draconian those sanctions should be. I'm not sure that our long-term interest or our short-term interest lies in further economic distress on the part of North Korea. Because we know they have some stuff that there's a market for. And I don't really want to take the risk that some of our actions would increase their willingness to put that stuff on the market. So I think we've got to bear this very much in mind.
I have one more question that I'd like to ask you both before I open things up to the audience. And I think Marcus has sort of maybe hinted at some of where I'm about to go. But whenever we consider how to address North Korea, there is the external factor, which is that there are other actors other than the United States and South Korea at play. China obviously has a big role, and we've seen, at least China's attitude towards North Korea perhaps shift under Xi Jinping. From your comments, Dr. Noland, it's clear that perhaps Russia's idea of engagement might not be the most useful, the rail lines and the pipelines and the railways. But where do we see Russia and China sort of fitting into this? And is there even the possibility of getting on the same page? Because one of the classic, challenges has been, when we are trying to engage, someone else might not be, or when we're trying to take and really pressure the North Koreans, there's an outlet somewhere else.
I thought you were asking the question.
Age before beauty.
Thank you. I think it's probably not going to be a series of actions that we're going to be able to take in lockstep with everyone else. I give a certain amount of pride of place, if you will, to South Korea. If South Korea could begin to pull together the outlines, at least, of a comprehensive overall strategy for dealing with the North, I would be in favor of the U.S. quietly saying to the South Koreans, we support you. You guys go out and make this happen. Because in the end, it is called the Korean Peninsula for a reason. And we should not arrogate to ourselves some sort of divine wisdom about how to reorganize that place. Every time we've done that elsewhere in the world, we tend to create more problems than we solve. So I would give South Korea that. And I think for obvious reasons, you can't deny the role of China in all of this. And I think that the Chinese would be attracted to the notion of disaggregating engagement in various compartments and doing different things. We don't all have to do them at the same time. They're already doing some things which we don't like, but there's not really much we can do to stop that. And I'm not sure there's much the Chinese government can do to stop that either. So I would say, let this go on.
I have a blog It's called Witness the Transformation. I put a blog post up this morning, the title of which was Coordination Failures. This is a constant theme. When the United States tries to push North Korea up against the wall to make, you got a choice. You can maintain your nuclear weapons, and be cold and hungry, or you can give up the nuclear weapons and you can enter the international community on a more respectable, prosperous basis. When we try to push them against the wall, China, and at times South Korea, has given them the safety valve, because ultimately they fear instability on their borders more than they fear nuclear weapons. So coordination and coordination failures are at the heart of this, and the North Koreans are masterful of playing groups off against each other. Right now they seem to be trying to play China against Russia, or really Russia against China. China's taken a somewhat harder line, so they've opened up to Russia, which, and given all the events in Russia, Russia's happy to kind of getting re-engaged with North Korea and give us a little heartburn over on that side of the world. So this is a constant theme. If you look at the nature of at least the economic engagement, I want to be very clear, economic engagement. I'm not talking about diplomacy or nuclear weapons at this point. If you look at the nature of economic engagements and you look at the two largest trade partners of North Korea, China and South Korea, it is ironic, but it is the enterprises from the nominally communist country that behave like capitalists in North Korea. And it's the firms from the capitalist country that behave like the socialist tools of foreign policy when South Korean firms go to North Korea. So Chinese engagement in North Korea is not always going to be to our liking, but at the end of the day, and I've done surveys on this, these Chinese enterprises are there to make money. They are not charitable institutions, and they are not getting much direct support from the Chinese government. And if they can't make money, or if the North Koreans expropriate their assets, they leave. And so the nature of Chinese engagement with North Korea is going to be pro-market. It's going to be on market-conforming terms. There presumably will be some learning that occurs on the North Korean side. And right now you see, for example, one of the fastest growing categories of trade between China and North Korea is t-shirts. Because this stuff is getting increasingly expensive to manufacture in China, and they're starting to move factories into North Korea. And that is a real kind of raw knuckles capitalist enterprise, is making low-end apparel. And so that's the nature. That in the extractive sector is really where the traction is in China-North Korea relations. And so I think that there will be some poverty alleviation because of it, and there'll be some learning that occurs. And it isn't always going to be the way we like it, and there'll be times when we want to turn it off, and the Chinese won't turn it off. I mean, that's clear. But there may be some benefit to what the Chinese are doing in North Korea on the economic side. South Korean side is harder to see. The South Korean economic engagement is much more, it's ironic, but it's much more entangled with the state. It's much more politicized, has a much greater degree of public subsidy component to it. And that's almost by nature of the fact that I think that the basic problem that the North Koreans face is this. They've been lying to the North Korean people for 2 generations about the nature of South Korea. So if a bunch of Chinese come into North Korea and they've got better cell phones than anything the North Koreans have ever seen, they're bigger, they're better dressed, they've got better cell phones. At some level you can explain it away that they're Chinese. But when the South Koreans start coming into North Korea and they start spreading out in the country and they're trying to make business, and they're bigger and they're better dressed and they have better cell phones and they have a lot of money to splash around, it's going to create fundamental cognitive dissonance in the population. And this is why I think the North Koreans have kept them so tightly constrained. It's really a fear of what large-scale, more open-ended South Korean economic engagement could mean in terms of people's thoughts and the political culture. So in terms of that process of encouraging marketization and getting people to think in market terms and not just as commerce as being a form of political tribute, weirdly enough, the Chinese may actually have a more positive impact at the end of the day than the South Koreans do.
Troy, if I could just
Yeah, no,
add
please.
one quick point to try to give some form to what I think Marcus is saying and what I've hoped I've been saying. I think a reasonable goal of the strategy that we employ with participation from China and South Korea should be to tie North Korea into a ever-intensifying network of economic self-interest with its neighbors. I mean, they're at the heart of the most dynamic economic region of the world. And I think you can only moderate their behavior by giving them a positive stake in stability and in the absence of threats to the region's security. And that's why I think that more pipeline connections, all these things make great sense from the point of view of those who want to transform North Korea, because you create an environment in which North Korea realizes they pay a heavy penalty if they begin to misbehave. That's not going to guarantee that they're going to suddenly be nice guys, but I think it is a goal toward which we should be moving. Instead of saying, you stop your nuclear program and dismantle it, and then we will start talking to you. And that's an oversimplification of what that school of thought believes or is advocating, I understand. But I think it should be the creation of this growing network of economic interaction and economic self-interest within the region.
In essence, we need to ensure that they have something to lose and don't want to lose it.
That's right.
I'd like to take some time and open it up to the audience for questions. Please just give your name and affiliation. Gentleman in the front, please.
I'm Peter Humphrey. I'm a former diplomat and current analyst. Y'all have spoken about the sort of 75% probability case in which we're looking at regime evolution and basically the world signing off on regime preservation. But I wonder if you both might say a few words about the strategic surprise 25% case in which Kim Jong-un does not live a natural lifespan and our engagement with any successor regime.
I'll just say very briefly, I think that would be an outcome much to be desired, but it depends on what the successor regime would look like. My basic problem is that I don't think that over the last 3 administrations that the U.S. has really had a viable strategy for dealing with North Korea. We pursue these myths. One myth has been, well, North Korea is going to collapse, so we don't have to take it seriously. Another myth has been, well, it's China's problem, and China will solve this problem. Neither of those two things has come to pass. Now, they may in the future, and I certainly wouldn't even try to predict when North Korea might collapse or when something might happen to Kim Jong-un. But I think you have to, as Bill Perry was fond of saying when he was engaged in all of this, you have to deal with North Korea as it is, not as you think it might possibly be in the future, and not as you think it is, not as you would like it to be, but as it is. I think that what we need to pursue is a policy that takes account of the 25% possibility that you cite, and not one that veers back and forth. Now, can we do that in our political system? Probably not. So I don't mean to be depressing, but
Positive words.
There is a research institute in Seoul called the Ilmin Institute of International Relations. And last year they managed to locate 135 experts on North Korea. Given what I said about Vice President Mondale's admonition, I was not one of the experts that they consulted. But they found a multinational cast of 135 people, and they administered a very long questionnaire. It's actually a very interesting report. If you Google Ilmin Institute Future of North Korea, this PDF will pop up. And you got 135 people, so there's not complete consensus. But the basic expectation of this group was that the Kim Jong-un regime had a life expectancy of 10 to 20 years, that it was likely to fall due to intra-elite conflict, and that the final denouement would be unification with the South. What was interesting, and the survey not only addressed that issue about transition, but also nuclear weapons program and so on and so forth. There was absolutely zero support for the idea that they're willing to trade away the nuclear weapons program at this point. It was striking. That view had literally zero support. The other thing was striking was how distinct, because on many of the questions they broke out the answers by the nationality of the respondent. That the Chinese respondents had very distinct views. The rest of the world thought China has a lot of influence in North Korea. And the Chinese experts thought that really China had virtually no influence in North Korea, and that really it was sort of the United States problem to solve.
Yes, right here.
Right here in front.
Hi, my name is Amy Lau, and I'm from the Committee of Human Rights in North Korea. Just thank you for coming today and speak to us. I'm just curious as to how will the 2016 presidential election change the dynamic of engaging with North Korea, and your opinion about that?
We're going to have to wait to 2016 to find out, because I think it depends to some extent on what that administration looks like in 2017 and beyond. I do not believe that the current administration is going to be able to put in place and begin implementing anything approaching the kind of ambitious strategy that admittedly Marcus and I are advocating. It's not the same strategy in all respects, but I think given what this administration has on its plate right now, it hopes to get to 2017 without a major crisis on the Korean Peninsula. Now, maybe there are possibilities to make some progress in limited places, but there's not going to be a kind of grand bargain emerging. I suspect, fear, there's not even going to be emerging a kind of step-by-step measured strategy on the part of the United States, given what we're contending with. I don't mean this as criticism. More or less objective reality.
So my attempt to be objective about entirely subjective issues is that if you were going to get some sort of grand bargain that would involve a normalization of relations, a peace treaty to end the Korean War, real restrictions on the North Korean nuclear program, security guarantees, but also credible penalties for violating those agreements. If you were going to get that kind of deal, given the American political system and where we're at today, I think that would probably require a Republican president, simply because I think that it would be very difficult for a Democratic president with a Republican Congress to make that kind of deal. I mean, our history has been that North Korea issue is not a central issue in the American political system, but it can be used conveniently as a political football to beat people over the head. And so I think because of the way our political system operates, to get that kind of grand bargain, you would really need a Nixon to China type moment, or Menachem Begin doing peace with the Egyptians. It would have to be somebody who was sufficiently conservative that they could make a deal with the North Koreans and make it stick here at home.
Scott.
Scott Snyder, Council on Foreign Relations. Arguably, the administration's main focus, and maybe only focus with regard to North Korea, really has been the denuclearization objective. And listening to this conversation, I'm wondering whether there are, and of course it's at a time when the North Koreans have been even more clear that being a nuclear weapon state is important to their own sense of legitimacy. Are there any other subsidiary objectives to the denuclearization objective that the U.S. government should show interest in or be open to pursuing? And what is the means by which to achieve those objectives?
Well, I'm going to say something that'll probably give Steve heartburn, but I think
Won't be the first
it
time.
won't be the first time. So I think that one thing we haven't talked about today is human rights. And I mean, I personally think that's an important part of the agenda. I think that when it comes to human rights, we have a kind of we have two track options. One track is what I would call the inside track, and that is working through the United Nations and other formal bodies through diplomacy. And I've always personally been quite skeptical of the efficacy of pursuing that track. Although I have to say, the work of the Commission of Inquiry, it just vastly exceeded my expectations, as well as the subsequent activities that have come after the COI report. So I do take my hat off to Justice Kirby and the other members of that committee and their staff. I think they've done a fantastic job. So I think there's a role for the United States to play to continue to push the human rights issue within those sorts of UN bodies and other types of formal diplomacy. But I think we also ought to be playing a long game, which means talking directly to North Korean people. So I would say increase support for Radio Free Asia, increase the amount of radio broadcasts going into North Korea. And I don't mean propaganda. I grew up in a rural area, so I would start out with news you can use. I mean, North Korean fishermen listen to South Korean weather reports because the quality of the weather reports are better than the North Korean weather reports, and weather matters. So I would start off, push weather reports, crop prices, things people can use, and then you can just read them in the New York Times or whatever, in terms of substantive content. But I would increase the amount of broadcasts going into North Korea, and I would do whatever I could to, basically maximize. I guess I'm going backwards on this one. I would also maximize exchange, cultural exchange. They want to send Taekwondo teams over here, great. They want to have the New York Symphony back for a second time, great. But especially getting them out more than getting our guys in. Get them out. Let them see things. Now, I recognize there's a contradiction between those two things. The more we do on the second may make it harder to make progress on the first. I guess my view of the world is I'm willing to accept that contradiction and accept that going forward with that second unilateral track may cause some problems on the first track, but I think it's worthwhile. So human rights, both tracks, would be something I would say the United States government ought to be doing.
I'm kind of, as somebody else who grew up on a farm, I'm attracted to the prairie home companion approach to North Korea. And I have no objection to that. I do think that over the last several years, we have been too mesmerized, if you will, by the nuclear issue. That is the one place where we have a strategic interest involved. And so I'm not saying we should dismiss it or ignore it, but I think we, as someone said, I think it was Marcus, this is a long game. And we continue to delude ourselves in some respects that it can be a short game. Now, it could turn out to be a very short game if something awful or something happens in North Korea. We may not like that, as it turns out, but that's a possibility. But I think that we've not been able to move effectively on other areas of North Korea's interest and other areas of North Korea's behavior. And I, too, believe that human rights is an important issue. And I've been around long enough to remember the Helsinki Accords. The difference, of course, is that we, the U.S. and NATO and Europe, had something real to offer, at least they thought it was real, to offer the former Soviet Union in exchange for this significant increase in transparency and access. And that was a recognition of the existing borders. Now, I don't know what the equivalent of that would be with regard to North Korea, other than maybe a recognition by South Korea that North Korea is always going to exist and that we're going to do everything we can to make sure that that's the case. But I don't see the elements of a kind of grand bargain pivoting around the human rights issue as there was in the case of Helsinki. I think the best hope for bringing about an improvement in North Korean human rights lies in the kind of bit by bit, step by step approach to drawing them into a regional economic web. Remembering always, of course, that we're not going to find uniformity of views within the region as to where we want them to go on human rights. There are other countries involved, and they have other views. But I think most people find abhorrent in 2015, even in those other countries, the kind of behavior that North Korea exhibits on the question of human rights.
All right, we're almost out of time. So what I'm going to do is I'll take these two last questions together. So the lady in the front here, and then Larry, and then we'll wrap up.
Hi, I'm Grace Kong. I'm an associate at the Institute for Korean American Studies. I have kind of an out-of-the-box question, but it is in line with the comments that have been said, and that is the idea of the U.S. Engaging with North Korea in economic development. Park Geun-hye, of course, in her Dresden speech, had a vision for significant development projects with the North if the U.S. could work with South Korea to do that kind of activity to enhance this regional economic web that Ambassador Bosworth has spoken about. Could the U.S. entertain such an approach?
Larry Nix from CSIS and George Washington University. I think the cynicism about denuclearization that Marcus pointed out with regard to that survey is clearly reflected here in Washington, including, I think, the attitude of the president. So if that cynicism is basically correct and realistic, that denuclearization is an impossible goal, a bridge too far, is a more realistic objective for any diplomacy on the nuclear issue containment. And that is to contain North Korea from reaching that next step, which the commander of NORAD mentioned just a couple of days ago, developing that ICBM and a nuclear warhead for the ICBM that can reach the United States. Is if denuclearization really is no longer attainable and unrealistic, is this more limited objective potentially attainable, but what would we need to offer the North Koreans in a serious negotiation about that kind of more limited objective on the nuclear issue?
Well, I'm an economist, not a diplomat, and I didn't even stay at a Holiday Inn Express last night. So I'll answer the first question. I'll let Steve answer the second one. On the first question, there's a variety of forms of engagement, humanitarian engagement. I think the North Korean regime is abhorrent, but if you have starving kids, feed them. So I believe engaging with North Korea on a humanitarian level unconditionally, recognizing that even that form of engagement in some way strengthens the regime. There are ways of doing it that has less strengthening the regime effects and so on. In the interest of time, I won't go into those details. Economic development, however, is rightly conditional on policy. And the constraint to today has not been the unwillingness of the rest of the world to engage with North Korea on economic development. It's been the unwillingness of the North Korean government to engage with the rest of the world on terms that are accepted by 160 other countries around the world. So 1997, when the North Koreans approached the IMF, the World Bank, as soon as they figured out there was going to have to be a modest degree of transparency in their financial records and so on, they walked away. More recently, there's the spate of stories that they approached the Chinese about joining the Asian Infrastructural Investment Bank. Same story when the Chinese said, well, show us your tax records and the industrial composition of output. They walked away. So when North Korea is ready to engage on the terms that the rest of the world seems to find acceptable in terms of the rules of the game, I think the rest of the world, including the United States, some level, would be willing to engage them. Final part of engagement is private commercial engagement. And this is going to be absolutely essential because ultimately it's the private sector that has the blueprints, it's the private sector that has the technology and the capital and the worldwide marketing and distribution channels that one is going to need to reinvigorate the North Korean economy. And at the end of the day, the involvement of the world in the humanitarian sphere, in the economic development sphere, and finally in private sector commercial activity is critically dependent on the policies and behavior of the North Korean government. And until those change, it's going to be very hard to move forward on these things regardless of what the diplomatic situation is. And the diplomatic situation today does not help forward movement on these issues.
Yeah, there should be no mistake. The primary problem on the Korean Peninsula is resident in Pyongyang. It's not resident here in Washington or in Seoul or Beijing. The primary problem is the behavior of the North Korean regime. So I think in every effort that has been made over the last 25 or 30 years to deal with the nuclear issue, we have started and should probably continue, in my judgment, with a demand that we need a verifiable freeze at the minimum on where they are. Now, verifiable is a key word there, and it's not easy to achieve. I think we could get some satisfaction, but probably not enough to satisfy all Americans and all others as to what we've taken. But at a minimum, before we could go forward here, we need that kind of undertaking that we can, generally speaking, have some level of confidence in. We can't. It would be inconceivable politically for us to sit down and talk to the North Koreans seriously about the kind of economic engagement that Marcus and I have discussed while they continue on their merry way with regard to the development of nuclear program, their nuclear weapons program and their missile program. So we would have to go back, as we did in the so-called, the much benighted Leap Day agreement. They had, the freeze was in there. Now, people had varying levels of confidence as to what that meant, but you can't ignore the issue.
All right. Well, I think we've had a really interesting discussion. I think one of my key takeaways is that, rather than look at one specific large issue, we need to be looking at sort of discrete, independent issues where we can take and perhaps make some progress and perhaps encourage some level of change. But with that being said, if you'll join me in thanking Dr. Noland and Ambassador Bosworth for a very interesting discussion. Thank you.